My new book, Facts That Aren't True, is out now. Don't forget about my other book, Rational Answers to Stupid Questions. Click the link in the description now. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, and ever since Lawrence Krauss had literally the worst performance I've ever seen at DebateCon talking to Inspiring Philosophy, that inspired me to want to do it even more. I mean, Lawrence, it seemed like he just thought being there and gracing us with his presence was like his gift to us, and he was just happy to opine on things that he thinks. I'm going to make sort of my own argument, and I'll respond to some of the things that Michael Jones brings up. My answer to the question of is Christianity dangerous is different, I think, than a lot of people's. If you really know me, then you know that I'm not an anti-theist. There are certain dangers in the world where if we eradicated them today, the world would be a better place tomorrow. I don't think that way about religion. I do think, and I do actually hope, that in the future, we gradually become less and less religious. But I think if that was just removed from the world today, people have to believe in something, and I have polling that can back this up, and people would form their identities in a vacuum in other ideas that people would take advantage of, and it could be catastrophic. Think of the nationalist and populist movements that are going on all throughout the world that are bad. I'll explain by way of analogy, I guess. So imagine somebody tried to argue with you that tigers aren't dangerous. And they said, in fact, in the United States, dogs kill around 100 people every year, whereas on average, tigers kill probably like 0 people or maybe 1 person a year. Now, this is true, but it's only true because in America, tigers are put in cages. So my main argument is something like that Christianity in the modern world isn't so bad because it has been secularized. It's been put into a cage. So just how dangerous is Christianity? I think that's kind of hard to say because we can look at things historically. On the one hand, Columbus did all these absolutely horrendous things, and so did many conquistadors, and they read the Requerimiento, and that came from the blessing of the Pope. And they said, we do these things because we are good Catholics or whatever, and this is our duty. But at the same time, for the example of Columbus, the monarchs back home, Ferdinand and Elizabeth, they denounced him. They actually had him arrested, and they specifically said that he's being a bad Christian. I've talked about this a lot before. When people try to say, for example, that Christianity ended slavery, I always point to, from who? Christians. So you could actually make the argument, it would be equally logical to say that Christianity lost a war to preserve slavery in the United States. Now, nobody says that. And people don't generally say that Christianity won a war on slavery. They just say the Union won the war. But they credit Christianity. My take is we had them on both sides cancel out like terms. And what do we find? Abolitionists abolished slavery, and they did it for reasons that obviously don't come from a Christian ethic. It has to come from somewhere else because they're interpreting their Christian ethic in that way. So then, is Christianity dangerous, or can people believe whatever they want to believe and ground it in anything? Well, the point I'm going to try to convey is that Christianity is a unique danger. If we didn't have the Bible, it's very difficult, it's almost impossible to imagine how we would ever have had a world where witch trials happened, jail time for blasphemy in the United States, jail time for being a homosexual, the incalculable loss of scientific research on because of the ban on stem cells, and much more. There are things that specifically come from Christianity that luckily, I think, have been defanged. Obviously, other kinds of tragedies would occur, but many tragedies are only possible because of religion, and I think that Christianity is no exception. Now, I'm also this big believer of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and the formation of secular governments around the world. I find it no coincidence that that progress has coincided directly with, humans, basically every conceivable metric of human well-being has coincided with a rise in those things and religion becoming less and less relevant in the world. There are studies, you'll hear about some studies, I'll try to bring some up that say otherwise, but I think that there are fundamental flaws in a lot of these. I can try to give you a sneak peek. This is a paper that I've seen Michael Jones use before, so The Influence of Religion on Interstate and Armed Conflict. And it says, I think this is the paper that says something to the effect of, high religiosity actually correlates with people not wanting to engage in interstate armed conflict. The problem is, look at the time period. It doesn't even start until 1946. That is well after the influence of a secular constitutional republic, which we are, and all these Enlightenment principles coming in and sort of decreasing the negative effects, the worst effects that religion has on society. Other problems I've seen are papers get there's a paper on violent crime. I don't have it pulled up at the moment, but I know that it gets used in this debate that Michael Jones had with Holy Kool-Aid years ago. And it talks about religiosity and crime being negatively correlated. I saw multiple of those studies, and a huge problem I saw with them is that all the studies ended before the crime drop rate in the 90s. The drop in violent crime, actually globally, it's not just in the United States, but that drop in violent crime is really unprecedented. So if religiosity did have something to do with the rate of violent crime being negatively correlated in, the majority of the 20th century, what about the greatest drop in the rate of violent crime, which you might not be surprised to learn coincides with the greatest drop in those who identify as being religious in this country? If the explanation is, look, the data from the beginning of the 20th century to the 90s says that religion has something to do with this, but then after that point, the greatest drop in crime happened, coinciding with the greatest reduction in people identifying as Christian, well, that prior conclusion doesn't predict the future evidence. So I think we have a problem here. There's another important thing that it won't really fit anywhere as I go through and watch the video or anything. So I'll have to say it here, and it takes a little while to go through. But it's that I find that secular ideas are more relevant and persuasive, and I think powerful. Michael, later in this debate with Lawrence Krauss, he starts screaming toward the end about well, if you want to keep all the goddamn Muslims out of Europe, then you better start acting Christian. Instead of putting up a sign that says no Muslims allowed, how about disarming bad and dangerous ideas? You can't Christianize Islam. That's the problem. So no Muslims allowed is your only policy choice at this point, if you give that prescription. But it goes both ways. You can't Islamize Christianity either. But what you can do is you can secularize both of them. And it has been done before. The course of history for this is kind of going backwards in a lot of the Islamic world. But Iran was a very good place to live, or a relatively good place to live, until the 70s. The public life was pretty good for both men and women, judged by, the health outcomes and whatever other kind of standards of their time. But that was the case until the 70s, when war and destabilization broke out and groups of fundamental radical lunatics took over and turned it into, essentially, the Handmaid's Tale has come true in some parts of the world. It could come true in this part of the world. Or is the difference that Islam is just somehow fundamentally worse and different than Christianity? Well, if we just literally compare texts and compare the philosophies of thinkers today, you could reach that conclusion. But how did we get there? I don't think it's as simple as whatever each book says or anything like that. I think it's because the secularization has largely been accomplished in the Western world and with Christianity. Michael and many others, they base all of their arguments on data that has come after that secularization process in the Western world. I actually already front-loaded that with some of those studies. Now, of course, this does invite the response or the retort of, oh, well, the Enlightenment thinkers, the framers of the Constitution, all of those other people, they were Christians. Well, the problem with that is that everybody historically, in all these areas, like in the West or whatever, they've always been Christian. So do you honestly think that you can sell me on the idea that the West went from being not really influenced by Christianity for 1,800 years, and then all of a sudden people really tapped into the true meaning of what it means to be a Christian, and then for the first time, or nearly the first time ever, started applying those standards, and human progress suddenly skyrocketed? Hell no. Now, this is tricky because a lot of what I say is more of an argument than it is, like Michael's saying, is to throw up a bunch of papers. But we certainly don't have survey studies of people living 400 or 500 years ago, 1,200 years ago, or anything like that. Now, there are anthropological studies that can and have been done, though. And the data is really clear on this. I talk about this in both of my books, I believe, Facts That Aren't True and Rational Answers to Stupid Questions. But we used to live in a much, much more violent and war-prone society in the past. So again, what was Christianity doing for 1,800 years? Why does it get credit? Why does it get to exist for 90% of its history, 1,800 years, 90% of its history? Why does it get to exist and not have brought about these things that have happened in the last 10% of its history, and then it gets credit at the very end? I just find that to be pretty odd. Christianity and Christians in the West, that led to hanging people for witchcraft. It led to the enslavement and extermination of indigenous people for the crime of not surrendering, for the other non-crime of not being born Christian. It rounded up Native children and put them in residential schools where they died by the thousands there as well. It enacted laws saying that you can't blaspheme despite the fact that we have a First Amendment. It enacted laws saying interracial marriage is against God's will, and countless other violations that were systematically undermined, not by appealing to the Bible, but by appealing to our general humanity. Now, Christians will say that that was done by them and by reaching into Christian ethics or being inspired by Christian ethics, the Bible, whatever, while just ignoring that all of those battles that we've won, in every single instance, those victories were all against injustices put in place by them. Christian societies would kill, torture, jail, ostracize, whatever, all kinds of things for all kinds of non-crimes. Historically, this happened for hundreds of years, and that was only ever undone by people saying, no, you don't get to use religion as a pretext for doing this to people. Let me be more clear. Listen to this.
What the Bible says, that homosexuals should be executed. Let me make myself clear. I believe that, and I've never gone back on that for 1 second.
You can't use Christianity to take power away from that disgusting human being, because he's using the Bible in order to justify what he's saying. All that would happen is he would claim he's the real Christian. Sodomy was actually labeled a capital crime in colonial America, and on the books, officially the penalty was death, though to our knowledge, it was never, the death penalty was never enacted for it. Thomas Jefferson did try to enact a bill in Congress to change the penalty to mere castration, but guess what? It failed. It wasn't until 2003 that sodomy was federally declared a protected exercise by the Supreme Court. So in this example, and I just picked a specific example, there are all kinds I could have gone with. What we have is Christian influence slowly being eroded over time, very slowly, unfortunately. What if Christianity was the only game in town? So now we'll go through this, and I'll respond to some specific things in here.
Which is better for society, Christianity or secular ethics? I will argue that data and science clearly shows Christianity. But I first want to point out I will not be arguing that if we all became atheists tomorrow, that society would collapse or we would experience immediate moral decay. I'll only be arguing that Christianity creates more optimal societies that can endure and generate progress.
I mean, I can just throw these up here right now, but there literally are studies that show that high religiosity correlates positively with social dysfunction. And actually, if you look at the most religious states in the country, they correlate very, very high with things like suicide, depression, teen pregnancy, the rate at which STDs are STIs, I think we're supposed to call them now, are contracted.
Again, the debate is about which is better for society. Demonstrating that Christianity is better does not mean other types of societies cannot flourish or endure. I'll just argue they do so in a less optimal way. Now, by Christian societies, I mean those that are based on Christian values and the majority of the population identifies as Christian, regardless of governmental laws. And by secular societies, I mean those that are based on secular ethics and the majority of the people identify as secular atheists. So I want to
That seems pretty unfair because the United States is a secular country, but the majority of its citizens are not secular. So we wouldn't even count. So if he uses studies based on the United States, I don't know. Maybe he just didn't write his opening statement very well, but that seems really completely unfair.
To be clear, I'm not arguing for theocracy or any type of government. Now, it's abundantly clear from multiple studies that Christianity has made the world a better place through missionary work. Christians believe everyone should be able to read God's word, and so when missionaries encountered cultures where the vast majority of people could not read, they developed written languages in schools to educate people. They also wanted to keep people alive, so Christians came up with hospitals, and then they advanced the study of medicine. Research demonstrates that missionary activity has led to higher literacy rates, more education, better hygiene habits, medical care, economic progress, freedom, human rights, and others. And this was not only accomplished in historical white regions, but in places all around the world. Without Christianity, the world would not be as educated and as advanced as it is now. Secularists did not go out and do this, and there is nothing that we could call secular doctrine that compels people to spread their worldview and educate people in the process. Christianity has Christ commanding the Great Commission, which makes it our duty to make the world a better place.
To me, this is kind of one of those ironic historical facts. Like, there's this scientist, I can't remember his name, but the scientist who invented chlorofluorocarbons, he ended up, I don't know if he had Lou Gehrig's disease or what, but he ended up becoming like partially paralyzed, and he built this fancy rig that would allow him to like be able to lift himself out of his hospital bed or something like that. He got entangled in it and died. Now, maybe it's true that literacy rates progressed faster than they otherwise would have because Christians were going around the world saying, you have to read this book. And without that, we wouldn't have been as motivated to force people to read and whatever. That's interesting. I don't have any problem with that. It doesn't mean anything about whether or not Christianity is true. But the kind of funny thing about it is what it did, I think, is by promoting that, people started to learn for their own. And I think that's a major reason why religion is becoming less relevant in the world. But another thing about that is this is kind of a genetic fallacy because there's nothing that a Christian can believe that a non-Christian can't believe, apart from like hyper-specific claims about the nature and divinity of God, Christ, etc. There's absolutely no reason you can't form a society that says just reading in general is of the utmost importance and we will make this happen. I mean, like literally the educational system does that today. It systematically educates more people than religion ever has. Now, did it only ever come about because of Christianity? That's a pretty hard sell. I think it only ever came about because societies have to become sufficiently complex before they can enact a system like that. Oh, by the way, who is it that wants to systematically undermine education in the United States?
Numerous studies show that religiosity is associated with more charitable giving to religious and secular organizations, whereas secularism is not. When compiling the data from multiple studies, this systematic review concluded that covering 77 studies reveals that religion, measured as group affiliation, values, beliefs, and the importance of faith to the believer, as well as religious service attendance and private prayer, most often positively relates with giving to outgroup and secular organizations.
Okay, it's worth pausing here. So Christianity people who are Christians give a lot to charity. Well, most secularists, like myself, believe in a robust welfare state. Social Security alone paid out $1.5 trillion last year, and an additional $1.2 trillion was paid out in welfare in 2022. That was the last year I could get a number for it. It's pretty goofy to say that this was done in the name of secularism, but it has nothing to do with Christianity. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, who are the people who are most against these programs? Political conservatives who are overwhelmingly Christian. In case somehow somebody disagrees with that, here's the polls. Now, I'm actually not saying it's because of their religion. It's because of their politics. But if Christians are the charitable ones, why are the most religious people the most against welfare? Now, I bring up these numbers for Social Security and welfare because, like, if we just imagined that all Christian charitable contributions disappeared, the overall effect on charity and we're calling Social Security and welfare a type of charity, and you can think that that's not fair, but I honestly don't think that it's unfair. So if we eliminated all the personal contributions from people who are Christian, then it would never come anywhere remotely close to these contributions. Plus, I mean, who knows if it's even going to exist anymore, but things like USAID, which has been fighting the AIDS epidemic in Africa, among many other things, that might completely go away now. And it's billions of dollars. Again, that's more than you get just from the Christian charity. If certain political conservatives who are overwhelmingly Christian got their way in this country, then we could actually see the elimination of the vast majority of the redistributivism, if that's a word, that we have. So to make it simple, if you could only have one, which one has the much greater effect and is the much greater total? It's not the Christian one. It's not even close. There's also some really cool research out there about moral perspectives between conservatives and liberals. I recently reread, I've been talking about it a lot, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I'd really highly recommend reading that book if you haven't. But in a nutshell, with regard to this moral perspective thing, conservatives, they tend to think that welfare breaks the fairness principle because it's not earned, while liberals, they think that it doesn't require being earned because it reduces harm, which is something that liberals are particularly obsessed with. Another important factor is almost certainly that conservatives care far less about out-group members, and welfare fits that because they tend to view welfare as money that's going toward them and not toward us or we. Now, I say all this to make the point that every denomination in whole is comfortably right-leaning in their politics. While unaffiliated and atheists, we run between 62 to 84% left-leaning. So it stands to reason that if Christianity grew, maybe more charity would be given, but that would be more than offset by right-leaning Christian politics actively gutting the welfare state. Also, I don't remember if it's the book Behave or Determined by Robert Sapolsky, but in that book, he talks about research with regard to charitable giving. He's talking about all kinds of things, but he makes this really interesting point that charitable giving actually equalizes when you control for keeping up with appearances. If we can imagine, and this really did happen, if some like billionaire tycoons all of a sudden got into this competition of who can donate more, then would we say that hoarding wealth actually has this trickle-down effect, and if you have billionaires, then you'll actually have more money to give out to people? Well, you could point to these anecdotal things, but the underlying cause behind that is actually, weirdly, kind of a form of selfishness. Finally, I'm so mad because I've been searching for this for a long time, and I can't find it. I saw this Dan McClellan video a long time ago, and I used to have it bookmarked. I don't know what happened. I can't find it. But he references a really interesting study. People were asked sets of questions. One question was, are we better off in society with the Bible or without the Bible? Then these people were asked a bunch of questions about, should we support immigrants? Should we give more to welfare? Several other questions that are directly tied to Jesus's preachings. What they found was no group of people overall said that we shouldn't do any of these things. However, the people that said the country would be worse off without the Bible supported all of those ideas less so than anybody else. I talked about these earlier, but I have these studies on religiosity coinciding negatively, or well, actually in this case, positively with dysfunction. One of these is for the United States specifically. The other one's a more global thing. Now, Michael likes to say that these studies commit what are called attribution errors. What does that mean? Well, here's how you could frame it. Sure, a religious society as a whole is unhappy, but when you poll individuals, the religious ones are actually happier. But what does that really mean? It's going to be different in every single case. But just ask yourself, why do you think Republicans are happier in Florida than in California? Because they're in power in Florida. That religious people sometimes are happier in an unhappy society or the happiest members of a happy society. Well, that itself may very well be an attribution error, especially when religiosity negatively correlates with the human rights indexes. That happiness could very well be in-group happiness and the luxury of being the dominant culture that imposes its will. Hey, we're happy that we don't allow gay marriage. If only those gay people were Christians like us, well, then they'd be happy too.
Furthermore, proliferation of religious devotion, faith in God, and reliance on the Bible has historically been a determining factor in establishing schools for children, creating universities, building hospitals for the sick and homes for the homeless, taking care of orphans and the elderly, resisting oppression, establishing law and order, and developing democracies.
Wow. Okay. So Michael likes to point out differences in extrinsic versus intrinsic religiosity. Extrinsic people, they basically ground whatever their preferences are in religion, and so it's sort of seen as not really the reason for it, the motivation behind it. They just say, well, the reason I do X is because of Christianity. Whereas intrinsically religious people, they are the ones that do it because of Christianity. I'd really like to know if anything you rattled off there accounts for any of that, because if it's predicted by extrinsic religiosity, well, then it doesn't have too much to do with religion itself. Now, once again, the people historically who have been opposed to that long list of things that Michael listed out, historically, every single time, they've always been Christians.
Meta-analyses have also found that religiosity is associated with more pro-social behavior and self-control. In an ever-increasing hostile world fueled by social media, more Christianity would be beneficial and aid in ways secularism cannot. Related to this is the issue of suicide and depression. Research that mostly pulls from sample sizes of Christians has demonstrated that religiosity is positively associated with lower levels of depression and suicide. These conclusions are robust considering multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses have found them. One study from Switzerland relied on census data of over 3.7 million adults and the death certificates of over 5,000 suicides. It found that suicide rates were the highest among those with no religion, more than double the rate of Catholics.
Something important to point out with suicide is that suicide follows roller coaster trends. It's actually quite dramatic the way that suicide can spike in societies and drop in societies. It's also massively influenced by civil politics and GDP. To give you a couple of examples, along the Golden Gate Bridge is one of the premier destinations for suicide in the United States. And many, many years ago, the city decided that they want to put a net under the bridge in order to prevent that. And what people argued was, I think this would raise taxes to pay for it or whatever. And people argued this would be a complete waste of money. It's not like we don't care about this issue, but if we put a net here, people are just going to go to skyscrapers or whatever and do the same thing. Now, eventually they did end up building the net, and guess what? The suicide rate didn't remain the same. It plummeted dramatically. I don't know if you know who Sylvia Plath was or have read any of her poetry. I haven't, but she was pretty manically depressed, and she wrote about death a lot in her poetry. And you guys have probably heard this before, people committing suicide by sticking their head in an oven. Now, I don't know about you, but when I heard that, like, just mentioned time and time again, I thought, like, what an absolutely horrendous and painful way to die. And how could you actually tolerate it long enough to actually kill yourself from it? They don't turn the oven on, they just turn the gas on, because the stoves used to have a lot of carbon monoxide. It is the original turn your car on and leave the garage door closed. She took her own life that way. A lot of people did. The UK decided to undertake the largest, I think it's the single largest engineering project that the country's ever done. They completely replaced all of their gas pipelines so they could do, I don't know if it's natural gas or a different type of gas or whatever, that doesn't have the carbon monoxide in it. I don't know why they had to replace everything to do that, but they did. And guess what? Suicide rates plummeted. We also want to ask ourselves, how much does this actually have to do with Christianity specifically? Belonging to a group or an organization is beneficial. I'd like to see some data that compares people who spend an hour in a week in some sort of secular or just completely irreligious program, group, or whatever, versus people in Christian groups. I think Justin from Deconstruction Zone, he was on Tim Pool with Alex Jones, and they discussed this, and I think he knows of some research, and there was no pushback against that. I really doubt that the difference in any way would be significant. So again, this goes back to, is there anything that a Christian does or believes in that a non-Christian can't do? I don't think that Christianity is uniquely suited for those beneficial outcomes, but we do know that it does the opposite. Something like 40% of homeless children in this country are LGBTQ. You're not going to sell anyone on that having nothing to do with religion in their household. Conversion camps and suicides associated with them, those are uniquely a Christian plague on all of those kids. I talked about residential schools earlier, but here's a quote from Richard Pratt. However great this victory has been for us, we have not yet fully learned our lesson, nor completed our work, nor will we have done so until there is, throughout all of our communities, the most unequivocal and complete acceptance of our own doctrines, both national and religious. Not until there shall be in every locality throughout the nation a supremacy of the Bible principle of the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. Again, the point I'm trying to make is people could belong to groups and have their depression alleviated without Christianity. But it's only with Christianity that those kinds of things end up happening. The residential schools one is a lot weaker because that was more about civilizing people they thought were barbaric, but they grounded it in the idea of biblical supremacy and that they had the superior culture.
Suicide rates have also dramatically increased over the past 20 years in this country, and given the research tying religiosity to lower suicide, it should come as no surprise that this increase has occurred as religiosity has been decreasing. And people like my opponent have indirectly contributed to this, since he's been on a crusade to eradicate Christianity from our modern society. Wow. Religiosity is also positively associated with better mental health, as seen in this meta-analysis, which looked at the data from over 850 studies. If you want a mentally healthy society of people who do not want to kill themselves, we should prefer a Christian society.
This is really a ridiculous false cause. Nobody kills themselves because they're not Christian. Plenty of people have killed themselves because of Christianity. Christianity is uniquely responsible for suicides and deaths, and your book calls for these people to be executed. The Christian perspective of everything I think is bad is because of Satan causes clear misery. It initiates mass panics, and it motivates people to do horrible things. Remember that woman from Utah who bound and tortured and starved her own children because she was convinced that it was actually the work of her and this other person. They had like this YouTube channel where they talked about raising kids, horrible as that is. And they said that the reason my kids won't listen to me is because they're possessed by Satan. So again, that's a unique evil that wouldn't come about if people weren't, or that can only come about because people are taught that particular ethic. Remember the pastor who said he wants to kill all those people, homosexuals, people that do. I didn't play the rest of it, but he talks about witchcraft and other things. So, thank anything but God that we have laws in place to keep Christianity from killing more people than Christians in this country want to. And what happens when Christians speak out against hate? They get publicly condemned by the president, by the vice president, by evangelicals, and by the right-wing mainstream and alternative news, by which I mean propaganda apparatus, who all collude together. If depression went up as religion went down, that wouldn't mean it's caused by secularism, but by a lack of something. And it certainly wouldn't mean that people couldn't organize into new groups.
Now, the next issue I want to focus on is the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism. With the recent rise of Christian nationalism, many people are worried about the effects of Christianity. But you might be surprised to find out that Christian nationalism seems to be more motivating among the least churched individuals on the right. This study from 2021 found that among politically right individuals, Christian nationalism was found among those who were the least religious. To quote, "We find no evidence that Christian nationalism mobilized church-based support in the election." They also say white nationalist groups in the United States explicitly use Christian nationalist rhetoric, but those who identify with such movements tend not to be strongly involved in mainstream Christian congregations.
So they identify as Christian, but they don't go to church a lot, so they're not religious. That is absolutely not the same thing as them either being atheists or agnostic or secularists. So I don't think that was even remotely an appropriate comparison. But let me agree and then disagree once again. I agree that a lot of those people justify their politics based on religion, because what we know about studies about people and their inner psychology is that their biases and their intuitions come first, and then what we call strategic reasoning comes second. Here's how I'm going to strategically reason why I think blank. I'm going to ground it in something else. But even if that's the case, why is it that identifying as Christian does nothing to persuade our worst instincts if Christianity is a force for good? All this does is reinforce that good people do good things and bad people do bad things, divorced mostly from whatever religious beliefs they have.
Finally, I want to look at the most damning issue for secularism. A secular culture may create well-being and satisfaction, but it would not be good for humanity if it could not sustain itself for multiple generations, because it would die out and be replaced by a less optimal culture. So any given culture must be able to sustain itself as part of the reason as to why it's good for humanity. Christian societies have historically been able to do this by producing replacement populations through sustainable birth rates. Hoffman, who's not religious, notes it is the conservatives and fundamentalists who are producing the most children because of religious tenets about being fruitful and multiplying. So,
in what sense is it because of that? The Bible says that word, therefore every Christian person just intrinsically is like, I need to bang my wife. There are a lot of things to say about this. Just because birth rates go down doesn't mean that the population ever increasingly goes down. The population can stabilize. Now, that doesn't exactly work for the current economic system that we have, but there's no reason that we have to have the exact same economic system forever. This is kind of an argument for the status quo. But another thing to keep in mind is that we don't live at the end of history, but in the middle of it. If we look at a map of our country, for example, we can see that the birth rates are highest or among the highest in some of the more religious states. However, if you look at the states that have the greatest drop in birth rates, at least half of the top states are among the most religious states. And we won't know where this is going to go for a really long time. But the way things look, it actually could be the case that eventually the more religious states have the lower fertility rate because their fertility rate is, yes, it's higher than most of the non-religious states, but it's dropping at a greater rate. And again, I don't know how you could possibly quantify in any way this idea that Christians are having children because they just intrinsically, because of their Christianity, believe that I need to pump out more babies. I knew this would be a long video, so instead of playing through what Michael Jones talks about in this Holy Kool-Aid debate, by all means watch it. It's a good debate. It's a cool debate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the papers that he showed that I was able to look at. A lot of them were paywalled, but some of them I have been able, but even for the ones that are paywalled, the abstract was all I needed to look at. But but I'll just tell you what I found. One paper was called "If You Love Me, Keep My Commandments." Religiosity increases preference for rule-based moral arguments. First of all, this is the paper where none of the data, it's a meta-analysis, but none of the data tracks anything past 1992, which, again, was right at the beginning of the greatest drop in violent crime we've ever seen. But worse than that, here's a quote from the abstract in this paper. Religious individuals who are committed to orthodox religious teaching display a deontological style of morality for reasons that extend beyond a need for structure, cognitive simplicity, or submission to authority. What does this mean? Deontological ethics is where, to make it simple, it's following orders, following rules is what's right. What this paper is literally saying is that religious people, these Orthodox in particular, they're more likely to follow orders. What does that mean? It means that they're easier to secularize. Again, the general thesis for the classical Enlightenment, liberal, whatever the hell I am, people, is that the institution and the expansion of these rights has literally changed public consciousness and sort of, in a weird kind of way, forced a new kind of ethic and morality on us. Look at this shit. Interracial marriage had a 4% approval rating in 1958, and today it's 94%. Christianity didn't do that. Legislation did that. Here's something I thought was pretty funny. This is from a TikTok video I saw Michael do. Just listen to this.
Agreeableness and conscientiousness, two of the big 5 personality traits, are the most important predictors of effective and cognitive empathy. And a meta-analysis found that intrinsically religious individuals are positively associated with agreeableness and conscientiousness.
Okay, so in other words, religious people are nice. However, I think he's combining things inappropriately here, because if you can read the text, it says that we compared 4 countries: China, Germany, Spain, and the United States. What they say toward the bottom, which is not highlighted, is, in terms of culture, we did not observe any distinct pattern concerning cultural differences. Maybe I'm reading it wrong or something. I mean, you tell me, but this paper that he cited seems to be saying that empathy has nothing to do with religion, since there was no noticeable difference between China and the United States. This is another paper that I've seen Michael use before, and this is a little bit lengthy, but let me read you a quote. He uses this to say that religion is negatively associated with crime. This kind of goes on for a while, but I'll have to read the whole thing. Researchers have examined the social control aspects of religion, in particular how factors such as level of participation and social support from such participation reduces criminal activity. Likewise, findings suggests that although there has been a sizable number of studies and diverse interests of researchers examining the religion-crime nexus, the researchers have not identified which aspects of religion have the strongest influence on crime reduction. In addition, the specific ways in which these factors are associated with crime reduction have not been comprehensively identified. More than 40 years of empirical scholarship suggests that religion suppresses criminal behavior. Nevertheless, these findings remain controversial as the literature neither accentuates the mechanisms of religion responsible for suppressing criminal behavior, nor does the literature reject the spuriousness of the religion-crime association relative to mediating effects of self-control and social control. Finally, our review suggests that methodological constraints infringe on the capacity for sociological and criminological to accurately ascertain the validity of the religion-crime nexus, often generating mixed or inconclusive findings on the religion-crime association. I'd love to tell you more, but it's paywalled. That's all I can tell you. This is another study that Michael likes to use. Here's a direct quote from it. As with many meta-analyses, the study is entirely observational, and thus its conclusions should not be interpreted as causation. This is especially relevant for moderator analyses, which are prone to chance findings. That quote is not in the abstract, it's down kind of toward the bottom of the paper. Okay, I have to play you this one because it's pretty bad.
A meta-analysis did something, this is a little bit different. It drew on Christian sample size to look and noted that Christian priming, religious priming, was associated with pro-social behavior. This is when individuals are primed with religious study, prayer, and then study next to a control group. It was found that priming with religious motivators resulted in more pro-social behavior.
Okay, this is that paper. What does this actually say? It says people who are religious are primed more effectively for pro-sociality when they are primed with religious themes. No shit. Like, it literally says right here, religious priming does not affect non-religious participants. If that's not confirmation bias, him using that paper, then I don't know what is. In the section about Christianity and LGBTQ prejudice, he points to a couple studies, one about religiosity and animosity toward lesbian and gay men. It says that there's positive correlation toward negative attitudes. Not surprising. But then the paper says, but it's in excess of what is required by their religious ideology. The book that says they need to die, it says negative attitudes are more intense than can be explained by belief alone. I don't really get where the people conducting the study got have the right to make that claim, I guess. But there's another study that specifically says, quote, the longer homosexual activities have been compliant with the law, the lower the homonegativity of the citizens. Again, this goes back to the grand narrative about the secularization process, and even the study Michael used earlier about the deontological ethic that Christians are more likely to follow. This is exactly what I would expect if a secular state monopolizes power and makes decisions. It defangs religion. You can't really come up with a secular reason to outlaw homosexuality, although I think Stalin did do that. The overall general conclusion, if I wanted to put it as simple as I can from this, is Christianity dangerous? If Christianity was the only game in town, then the positive feedback loop that would come out of that would lead to things like oppression and misery for a lot of people, there would be nothing to stop it. In the current complex modern world that is very much divorced from the worst things about Christianity, is Christianity dangerous? I think, yes, it is a unique danger. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but it is uniquely responsible for, you can't have all the child abuse in the churches without the churches. Could children be abused in other places? Yes, we know that they do. Would more children be abused if nobody went to church? Absolutely not. And the way that it takes away rights from other people, Christianity is in the way of that. It's not doing anything in favor of any of that. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Feel free to let me know what you think.